Good morning. Our first speaker this morning is a long-term resident of the Heritage Hill District in Grand Rapids, and he literally lives local history. In a continuing labor of love, he and his wife Mindy have worked since 1980 to restore the home they own there in Heritage Hill. It was early on that Don discovered the original family who built the home in 1890, the Earle family. He was a local artist, Lawrence C. Earle. Now an addicted researcher, Don is an avid family historian and preaches the importance of connecting both genealogy and local history research. History doesn't happen in a void. People make history. The local places are where history impacts families. So Don has served on the board of directors of the Western Michigan Genealogical Society since 1995, serving as president of WMGS from 2009 to 2014, and he's no stranger to this platform as he has presented at this History Detectives Forum in 2011, 2012, and again last year. I'm pleased to present Mr. Don Bryant.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. I do have to make one adjustment on this computer so this actually shows up on the screen. And ready to go. Thanks, David, for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. I've been looking forward to sharing information about Lawrence Carmichael Earle with you today. And after researching for over 20 years, I feel like I know him. He is called Larry in many of the records, and because I know him, I call him Larry too. So this presentation is not about his artwork exclusively. It is also about Larry the man, his life and family. Because he was an artist, and a very good one, he was written about quite frequently, which made it sort of easy to find information. I have so much information. Most of my work recently has been taking out what won't fit in 40 minutes. So I'll give you some hints on how to learn more at the end. Larry was born in Lower Manhattan in 1845. Let me introduce you to his family. Here's Larry's mom and dad, and that's John Edward Earle and Mary Matilda Dorset. John's Earle family line came to New Amsterdam, that's New York City, before it was New York. His family came about 1660. His ethnicity is English, that's the Earle side, but also he has a Polish grandmother, and he has a lot of Dutch grandmothers, so it's really diverse. Larry's mother, Mary Dorset, was John's second wife. She was born in New York City, and both her paternal and maternal lines were early settlers in New Jersey by the 1680s, and right close to New York, right up in that area. And she was probably of Huguenot descent. John and Mary were married in New Jersey in 1842. Remember, this is John's second marriage. They lived in Lower Manhattan, where John was a dry goods dealer, and they had 5 children. Besides Larry, there were James, Kate, Emma, and Grace. This is Mrs. Larry Earle, formerly Nellie Harmon. Her name was Helen, but she went by Nellie almost her whole life. They were married in 1882 near Chicago. That's where she was from. And she is the daughter of Edwin Harmon and Mary Huntoon of Kane County, Illinois. And they had 2 sons, both of them born in Chicago. John Horatio Earle, they called him Ray, and Lawrence Jr. Since I'm a genealogist and since WMGS is sponsoring this part of the History Detectives, I have to do this. But the names and the dates and places, they don't really reveal much about who these people are. and especially the kind of man John Earle was. As Larry's father, he was a huge influence on who Larry became. So there is something I found, a few things I found which illuminate John's character and personality, and this is one. First, a letter he wrote to his new wife, Mary, in New York City in 1842. She was home with her stepchildren, John's children from his other first wife. And John was on a business trip in Virginia and writing about his return plans, which involved train travel. And this is not the train he wrote on, but it gives you an idea that this was of the rail service at the time. This was brand new in 1842. My dear Mary, and then he writes about how anxious he is to see her and how slow the travel is. And his first two paragraphs are basically a love letter. John was a romantic. Quote, "To love is misery, to be beloved happiness, to love and be beloved by the object you love is bliss." End quote. It's sentimental. Sounds like a Valentine card greeting. In fact, I checked to see if he plagiarized anybody. And I Googled it, and that's the only thing that came up from him. His wishes for his children were the last part of his letter. And, quote, "Keep my children dear for me and tell them Pa will see them soon and hopes they have been good children. Tell Ella, who is age 3, Pa can't bring a dog or cat what can bite, as they might bite Pa, and then Ella would be sorry. And tell Mary Sophia, who is age 7, Pa can't get any sister babies here, but that Mom must get her one." End quote. The Earles moved from Manhattan to Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1856. 3 of John's 5 children from his first marriage also came with the rest of the family. From the 1860 census, we get an idea of John's economic status. He was a grocer and retailer in dry goods and a wealthy man. His net worth was $40,000 in Grand Rapids in 1860. That's equivalent to about 1.2 million today's dollars. So he was a millionaire. Aaron Dykeman, who was Grand Rapids' first jeweler, was a near neighbor, and he was worth $12,000. Louis Campaw, we know that name, $15,000. And John Ball was a near neighbor, and he was $50,000. So John was right up there. He was in the 1%, I believe. One more name is James Nelson, who was an industrialist. And I'll mention his name later, but his was $35,000 was his net worth. And on the left is a younger Larry Earle. He's about 20, I think, in that picture. On the right is Charles Garfield. Charles was his boyhood friend and became later a banker and later donated several acres of Garfield family land to the city of Grand Rapids. Guess what? Garfield Park. Larry's death, at the time of Larry's death, Charles recalled his first meeting him and his father. This was actually published in the newspaper. Quote, 1858. This was a story that happened around the area of Burton and Eastern and Seymour Square. I was about 10 years old attending Seymour School in Paris Township. During recess, we were playing around the school when a man and a boy stopped on to look. And the boy, a little older than I, was Lawrence Earle, and the man was his father. They were out squirrel hunting, had carried beautifully made small caliber rifles. The rifles, of course, interested us immensely, and we gathered around to look them over and to discuss their relative merits as compared to shotguns for squirrel hunting. The senior Earle seemed to like our looks, and finally he called us around him and said that he had a proposition to make, that he would give a rifle exactly like the one his own to the boy in school who stood the highest in his classes at the end of the school year. We called to our teacher, Miss McBain, and he repeated his promise. This was a great incentive for all the boys to study hard that winter, and at the end of the school year, 4 of us had exactly the same markings. They were Will Parsons, Marcellus Alger, recognize that last name, Frank Seymour, another familiar name, and myself. How to break the tie was something of a puzzle, and we solved the problem by three of us withdrawing in favor of Will Parsons because he was a cripple and he received the prize, end quote. Larry's interest in art began about this time. At the age of 12, you are looking at the work of his first teacher, Marinus Harting. Now, the Dutch pronunciation of that name is Marinus. I'm not going to switch back and forth. I'm going to use Marinus because it's easier to remember one pronunciation. But he was Dutch. And he was Grand Rapids' only artist at the time, an old Hollander, a native of Delft, Netherlands, and a Dutch master painter. It was paintings like this that you're looking at that Larry saw as he studied art and looked around in his teacher's studio. 50 years later, in 1908, so 101 years ago, Larry reminisced about his first encounter with Marinus. And you might recognize these words from the History Detectives brochure. Quote, "Oh yes, but this art is serious business, my boy. And you must learn to draw, goot, first of all, and draw some more. Always draw, for that the foundations of everything," end quote. Another painting by the old Dutch master, and continuing with Larry's words, he was writing this in third person. "And so the boy of 12 became a pupil and drew, but never was he thought quite right to take the brush and try for color. And never did he come to paint while Harting was his master, but just draw he must. And surreptitiously, the boy rebelled and secured the things required and went to work painting at home. A modest canvas for a first effort being finished, the boy's proud father tells him, "Take it up to show it to the master." And so he did. He shows the great work to the master, and the master looks and says, "So, well, just leave it with me. I fix it for you." And disheartened, he thought the world was at an end. Arriving home, his father said, "You just get back on that horse and go straight for that picture and bring it home as it is." And Larry actually ended this episode with, "And the great first effort of the boy exists today." He saved it, and it's unfixed. Here in the library, up on the 4th floor, we have artwork of two of Harting's other students displayed in the Vanderveen room. This is titled "Knowledge is Power," and it's painted by Frederick Stewart Church. And this scene of early Grand Rapids, created by another student, Sarah Nelson. It's titled "Riverfront of 1856." That's Grand Rapids as you're looking from across the river. Remember James Nelson, one of the census guys. He was Sarah's father, and so Sarah was also a neighbor of Larry's. A little better look at Sarah's painting. If it looks familiar to you, it was also used for Z.Z. Leiden's 1966 History of Grand Rapids. This was the cover art. And also for reference, the structure at the top of the hill on the left is the site of Butterworth Hospital. And from the Grand Rapids Historical Society research on their website, I found this quote: "The third house, the columned cottage, was on Ransom, which is the street just next to the parking ramp, goes north and south, or our parking lot, I should say, between Lion and Crescent, so just up a couple blocks, and believed to have been built in the 1850s, presumably by Miss Nelson's painting instructor, Marinus Harting," end quote. Zooming in, we see that Sarah actually anchors the composition of her painting on that structure, the cottage of her art instructor. The site of this now, if you're walking up there, it's where the Spectrum Butterworth staff parking ramp is, so you wouldn't recognize it. So we've learned about Larry's upbringing, his father's influence, his ethnic background, Polish, Dutch, English, Huguenot. Perhaps his artistic talent came through those Dutch genes that were very common knowledge of the Netherlands was one of the best places for artists. But Harting was, of course, very influential in Larry's development. And this was the start of his start in art world in Grand Rapids. But Larry also, besides art, loved travel, history, family, and baseball. After years of research, I can't help but characterize his life using a metaphor. He lived with a big paintbrush when it comes to the diversity of his interests, ambitions, his view of art and of life. And now we're going to look at some of the records that are demonstrating this. Larry loved baseball. He played right field with the Kent Baseball Club. In fact, he was a founder and the first secretary of the club, organized in April 1867. The club minutes book in the local archives on the fourth floor here are all written in his handwriting. With few exceptions, he signed his name L.C. Earle, but there was that voice in his head, play ball. Well, I'm sure that was true too, but it was also draw, draw, draw. And that voice has a Dutch accent, not like mine. Larry was known to make sketches of his team members playing ball, and some of these ended up on his studio walls. He developed long-lasting relationships with his teammates, and one by the name of Charles Eaton. Eaton and Lyon and Allen, and other names over the century, was the major printing house and bookseller in Grand Rapids in the 19th century. And this is Eaton and Lyon's trademark, a bespectacled owl. This began as a stuffed owl bought at auction and displayed in the storefront window, always drawing. Larry made a drawing of it and entitled it Bird of Night. And from that drawing, Larry's friend and cohort, Frederick Church, created this trademark. You probably cannot see the owls wearing eyeglasses. That's the bespectacled part. Sorry that I don't have a better image, but as a genealogist, I have other resources. I searched for a descendant of this owl, so we might know what he might have looked like. And this is the Eaton and Lyon building on Monroe, right near where Rosa Parks Circle and the Art Museum are today. And this was not a small enterprise. And that trademark appeared in countless newspaper ads and was Eaton Lyon's identity for decades. Larry had a small studio on Monroe near the bookstore, and maybe even perhaps within the building. Regardless, they allowed Larry to exhibit his work there. And collectors actually from New York came and bought some of his artwork. I imagine it was quid pro quo for the work on their trademark, or more likely it was just his friend Charles Eaton had something to do with it. This sketch by Larry is a self-portrait, and he's here in the middle holding his sketchbook, and they're in a place called the Ionia Skating Park. And then again, that voice, he's got that sketchbook, draw, draw, draw. Larry's cousin, William S. Earle, is on the left. And more about him in a minute, but in the third person I want to point out here is Israel Canton Smith on the right. In the 1860s, this also meant it was wartime. And Smith was Colonel Smith with the 10th Michigan Cavalry in the Civil War, and then later Brigadier General U.S. Volunteers in the Spanish-American War. He was a local military hero. Larry himself served in the last few months of the Civil War as a lieutenant in Virginia. In fact, every one of John Earle's 5 sons served. All of them were officers. They had enough money to pay substitutes, but they chose to serve. W.S. and L.C. Earle, photographers, is the name of this, Larry and his cousin. And they opened this in 1866. They were both about 21 years old. And the subject of the studio card is not identified, so if anybody here recognizes him, please let me know. During the 1860s, both cousin William and Larry helped out and apprenticed under John Earle's in his businesses. first the grocery and dry goods, and then Kent woolen mills, manufacturing, and then jobbers of hoop skirts and corsets. Back up here. I'm missing a piece here. But anyways, they advertise those corsets in the directories and things. Late in 1867, Larry left Grand Rapids to go to Chicago to study art, along with his friend Frederick Church. They both studied under Walter Sherlaw, a renowned Scottish-American artist who was an instructor at the Chicago Academy of Design. Sherlaw had studied several years in Munich, Germany. This is Larry's creation in 1871, and it's at the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco. Recognizing Larry's talent, which is obvious with this painting, Sherlaw encouraged him to follow his own example and travel to Munich for more training. This he did. And this passport application is dated June 1872 in New York City. Larry's age is 27, and he gave his address in Grand Rapids. It was sworn to by an acquaintance to prove who he was, Edward S. Earle, who happened to be Larry's half-brother, who never left New York City. And in November 1872, Larry was in Germany. This matriculation document records Larry's entry to the Munich Institute of Art. And this is what he looked like at graduation in March of 1874. So his training was 18 months at Munich. We'll review a little more of Larry's artwork in this decade. This is an early one, 1874. It's an oil on canvas that's called, painted in what's called the Munich style. He was fresh out of school, or maybe while he was in school. Typical subjects in this style are portraits, landscapes, still life, historical, and genre. Appearance is usually natural and realistic with dark and high contrast. Anybody know what genre means in this context? Well, you're in the right place to find out. It's an old term that infers scenes from simple everyday life. And Larry loved this aspect. Signature at the lower right is hard to see. Even when I zoom in on it, it's going to be hard to read, but it says L.C. Earle, München, and 74. And München is the German pronunciation from me, remember, it's not perfect, of Munich. And this is unusual for Larry to have the place of creation in the signature, but that's where this one has it. Again, 1875, this one's called Woodcocks in Dropping Flight, another oil on canvas. Game birds and other fowl, fish and animals of all sorts were favorite subjects of Larry. This again is in the Munich style. In the early 1870s, this was a very hard time for the Earle family back in Grand Rapids. While Larry was in Chicago and Munich from 69 to 74, the Earle family business, the Kent Woolen Mills, burned, destroying all the interior and machinery in January of 1873. And his father John died just a year later. He was 72. I don't want to skip too far ahead here. I'm confident that when Larry returned from Munich, he first came home to Grand Rapids. But then he soon went back to Chicago at the close of 1874, and he invited his widowed mother to live with him for a few years in Chicago. This is a day's bag, game birds, another oil on canvas in 70. We see Larry soon make a transition from oil painting to watercolor, and in 1878 from student to instructor of watercolor classes. 3 afternoons a week at the Art School of Academy of Design in Chicago. Watercolor was his new passion, in fact. He became one of the first collectors of Winslow Homer's watercolors when he purchased several at an auction in Chicago in 1879. I'm going to read a little quote from one of the biographies published later in this decade. It was regarding Earle. He has always been a painstaking and laborious worker, and though he executes with a rapidity that is very unusual, and that seems marvelous to those not accustomed to it, he nevertheless seems to be ever striving to improve his methods, and consequently shows a steady growth in the excellence of his productions, end quote. I don't know about you, but I'm hearing the echo of the old master's promptings here. Draw, draw, draw. Now hooked on watercolor, in September 1880, Larry boarded a ship bound for Europe again, this time to Rome and Florence for advanced training. He brought back his this particular painting, dated 1881, which is now at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, and it was produced in watercolor and gouache. Someone say, what is gouache? Good. Anyways, I'm glad you asked. Gouache was developed in the late 19th century, so in 1881 it was fairly new, especially in America. He learned this in Europe. It is a water media, paint consisting of a natural pigment, water, a binding agent, usually gum varnish, and sometimes additional inert material like chalk. Gouache is designed to be used with opaque methods of painting, and Earle shows a willingness here to push the limits of his craft and keep on the cutting edge, so to speak. FYI, this is a stunning picture, but it's in the archives at the museum. You have to make arrangements to be able to see it. We'll review more paintings in a few minutes, but I want to make a slight pause on that and go to Larry Earle's connections to this place, Ryerson Library. We've already mentioned a couple. The proximity of here to his training studio, paintings of two of his cohorts up on the 4th floor. And now recently, Julie Taberer, the manager up at the archives here, discovered an Earle painting right here in the library archives. And it may be one of his earliest oil works, probably in the late 1860s. We're still trying to figure that out. And it's not here, it's upstairs, but it does need restoration. So we may be taking up a collection later to give you a warning. But seriously, this document we're looking at proves even more of Larry's connections to this building that we're in. This is the title page of the Catalog of Loan Collection of Paintings for the Art Institute of Chicago, and it documents the opening of the new, quote-unquote, art museum in Chicago in 1887. This library was built in 1904 with funds donated by Martin Antoine Ryerson. For what it's worth, I got some genealogy here. He was born here in Grand Rapids, and he was an only child. His father was very successful in lumbering in Michigan and invested in Chicago real estate. Became extremely wealthy. His mother was the niece of Louis Campaw, and by inheritance, Martin Ryerson became the wealthiest man in Chicago in 1890. Give you an idea why this looks like it does. In the bottom section, we see the names L.C. Earle and then Martin A. Ryerson working together on the art committee of this new institute in Chicago. And then a man named Charles Hutchinson, sorry for the touchiness here. A man named Charles Hutchinson was president of the institute, and Martin was the money man. Mr. Hutchinson was the mover and shaker, and would use his influence to later organize the world's Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. Some crew there working on this art institute. Let's look at some more of Larry's artwork from this time period. This was painted in 1882, and it's during Larry's trip to Italy, titled "Two Women in the Doorway," and it's in watercolor and gouache. It was given to the Art Institute of Chicago by Chicago collectors, none other than Mr. and Mrs. Martin A. Ryerson. So they were collectors of Earle's work as well. Another work in his distinctive style is Les Belles Hollandaises. My French isn't very good either, but The Belle of Holland. And this painting is in the Smithsonian Institute. And here's a description that the experts at Brooklyn Museum of Art say about this painting. It commands attention when this watercolor hangs among oils by virtue of the solid buildup of opaque surfaces placed against the unusual foil of gold paint. The subject itself, a head study of a model in period costume, is not uncommon, especially for Munich-trained artists such as Earle. What does stand out is the dramatic intensity that the artist invested in this watercolor, a work that represented Earle in his 1888 debut at the National Academy of Design, end quote. About 10 years later, he would actually become associate of the National Academy, so they were impressed with him too. In 1887, Earle was also an investor and president of this company for a year, and that is his signature on this $100 stock certificate. So what was the Palestine Exhibition Company? Well, fundamentally, it was still art, but in live panoramic form. And it was presented in large rotundas built especially for these performances. Imagine 19th century IMAX. Panorama rotunda venues were 16-sided polygon-shaped buildings. And you can see inside of one here the painted background behind the actors and the staging. These panoramas were the biggest paintings in the world, 50 feet high, 400 feet long. Chicago had 6 panorama rotunda venues by 1893, so they were very popular attractions. Jerusalem on the Day of Crucifixion was one of the first productions in 1886, and it was done in Chicago, where these debuted. Larry kept right on painting with his big paintbrush. I ran across this watercolor painting about 4 years ago. The descriptive title was Seated Woman of Color Wearing Colorful Outfit. I could only imagine what a colorful part of this would be, since I could only see this black and white image. 3 years later, it came up for auction, and Larry's title for this was The Local Dress, and this was painted in 1885. This painting, by the way, just sold a few months ago for $5,000. So if you're interested in an Earle painting, you can still find them. This is a great example of his studio portrait work. He often put subjects in native costume. This is in oil, 1884. So Larry continued to paint in oil as well as watercolor. He just didn't switch overnight. This is a portrait of a woman with striped headscarf. Larry probably had his own title, but we don't know it. Larry had divided his time during the past 20 years between Chicago and New York City. In fact, he had studios in both places. These years saw a change in the residence for the young Earle family. In 1889, they moved from Chicago to Montclair, New Jersey, which had become known as an artist colony. But more importantly for Larry, it was close to New York City for more exposure in the center of the art world. His boys were 7 and 5 years old when they moved. This painting is of Larry Jr., done about 1898. He became a sales engineer and manager in the diesel automotive industry in Detroit. By 1920, he had an office on Church Street in New York City, exactly where the World Trade Center would be built 50 years later. And this is interesting. His brother, John, or Ray Earle, he was also an engineer in the auto industry in Detroit. And according to his obituary, he also painted watercolor. And he had a son, Jack Earle, who was survivor of the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. And he also painted watercolor. And it was Jack's granddaughter who actually contributed many of the family photos we're seeing today. Larry kept his many connections in Chicago. Remember his association with Charles Hutchinson, the mover and shaker? This art was commissioned for the Exposition's Commemorative Society. Larry was the only artist to have more than a single work in the official book of the builders. And if you've done any research on the Exposition, you'll know what that is. This is the North Canal Bridge. His second was titled South Horticultural Bridge, and they were both located on the Exposition grounds. And so these are first-hand images of the famous White City. For his contributions and work, Larry was recognized with a commemorative medal to Lawrence C. Earle, commemorating the anniversary of Columbus's landing. Earle also created 2 large murals for interior decoration of one of the White City buildings, the Manufacturing and Liberal Arts Building. When I say large, these murals were 33 feet wide and 18 feet high. These were on display to millions of visitors from around the world at the World's Fair, basically. Soon after this, in 1897, the National Academy of Design invited Larry to become an associate, so one of the highest honors in the American art world. All his work since 1897, he could now add the initials ANA, Associate of the National Academy. 1900, this is an oil painting on canvas. It is currently housed at the Chicago History Museum, and it depicts the World Columbian Exposition of 1893. And this is what Larry submitted for approval to the Central Trust Company of Chicago for a major project. And successful, he was awarded the project to create 16 murals, each depicting notable scenes of the entire history of Chicago from 1674 to 1899. They were for the new Chicago National Bank building being constructed, and they were to be installed in the arches in the main banking room at street level. Hence the half-moon shape of the canvases. Remember, they were 16 feet wide. This is the building. He, with his experience with the panoramas and the exposition, made Larry a very highly qualified for a project of this scale. But he also personally researched the history of Chicago for this series. So add local historian to his resume now. Larry finished them in short order. By 1901, he was done, of course, with that marvelous rapidity he was known for. And he applied for patents on these murals in July of 1901. Murals were created in a very large borrowed studio in Montclair, which is where Larry lived at the time. Rolled up, packed, and shipped the murals to Chicago, and Larry came along to oversee the installation. Speaking of Montclair, this was the Earle family home in Montclair, and incidentally, this property is now known as the Lawrence Carmichael Earle House. In 2017, it was nominated as a historic property in Montclair because of Earle's connection to the art colony. Larry's life changed when his wife Nellie died in August of 1907. She was just 48 years old, and he left Montclair and moved back to Michigan to be closer to his sons in Detroit and his sisters in Grand Rapids. How about some more connections to where we are here again? Here is the Earle House in Heritage Hill. This is my house now. We've lived there longer than the Earle family lived there, by the way, which is more than 30 years. Over the years, Larry visited Grand Rapids on occasion. Not all, but some visits were noted in the Grand Rapids paper, visiting family in 1902 as an example, and a couple of other visits. 1904, for an exhibition of his work at the new Ryerson Library. And in 1907, he was one of 5 celebrity jurists for an exhibition of art students and amateurs held here in the library. So Larry moved from Detroit to Grand Rapids in 1909 and made his home here on Union Avenue with his sisters, Kate and Emma. He continued to work at his trade, keeping a studio right downtown at the corner of Fulton and Jefferson, around the corner. He produced many portraits of local people. Some of his later work while living, as we saw in previous works, the often boring titles like, "This is a portrait of Dr. Charles Shepard," and somebody catch the fact that this is really the quack doctor. And that was Larry's name for this painting. And so add humorist to Larry's resume. He did do sort of comedy themes in some of his painting. This work was included at an exhibition of his work at St. Cecilia's across the street in December of 1910 for the new Grand Rapids Art Association. In fact, Larry became the Art Association's very first honorary member And during the exhibition, he donated a painting to the group, which was a portrait of Professor E.A. Strong, and well known in Grand Rapids, an old educator and the founder of the Kent Scientific Institute, which later becomes the Public Museum. That portrait was the very first work of art in the New Art Association's permanent collection. Pretty significant. This image is pretty well known. It's a St. Andrew's caddy. A little Scottish history here. St. Andrews in Scotland is still recognized ever since the 18th century as the home of golf. The original of this print was watercolor, and the whereabouts of the original is unknown. This print was copyrighted in 1904 for the Stetson Shoe Company, who had a line of golf shoes they were promoting. This print was very popular, and several runs of the print were made, the last one in 1928. He appears to be lighting a cigarette, and many descriptions repeat that, but that's not accurate. This is an oil on canvas that was painted about 1897, so prior to the other watercolor. It is unsigned, but I believe it to be the original image for the St. Andrew's caddy. There are slight differences. There's only one club and not four. It's not a cigarette he's lighting, and it's clearly a clay pipe, which makes better sense for the time period. And I'm going to skip quickly through, this is Frank Hooker, who was a Supreme Court justice, and this still actually hangs in the Michigan Supreme Court building in Lansing. And if you've ever been to Butterworth Hospital, you may have seen this. It's been in their collection for decades. That's the nurse. Here is without a doubt Earle's most recognized work, The Dutch Boy Painter. It's one of America's oldest and best known copyrighted trademarks. At the time, it was the National Lead Company. Since 1906, it's been in continuous use. Even today, Sherwin-Williams owns the trademark now. The idea came from the people of Holland, who had a worldwide reputation for keeping their homes immaculately whitewashed, and the main product for the National Lead Company was white lead paint. Rudolf Uke, who was of Dutch descent, worked at an advertising agency in New York and came up with the initial sketches. And then one of the best portrait and character painters in New York was commissioned to breathe into the rough sketch the breath of life, end quote. Lawrence Carmichael Earle. The Dutch Boy Painter magazine, which targeted professional painters, this is the March 1922 issue, and included a tribute to Lawrence after he passed away in November 21. On the cover, of course, this famous oil painting. And if you're curious, I can tell you about how the painting came to be. Anybody interested? There's enough of it. Here's the story. It was 1907. Michael Brady was 9 years old and played ball in the street outside Larry's home in Montclair and caught the artist's attention. And that little Irish boy modeled for the painting. And he grew up to be a well-known political cartoon artist in New York City. This is his cartoon, published sometime in the 1930s, and describes his experience modeling as the Dutch Boy Painter. His friends had a lot of fun teasing him about being Irish and posing as a Dutch boy. But Michael was interviewed, and he stated that from the time he first posed, he had but one ambition. He forgot his former intentions of becoming a cowboy or a circus acrobat. He was going to make pictures when he grew up. And with Mr. Earle as his hero and a print of the portrait of himself as a direct incentive, he spent long hours covering sheets of paper and occasionally fences and walls with his first artistic attempts. And when I read that, it reminded me of this painting that I found. This is actually in Australia. Somebody contacted me there. This is a 1883 watercolor Larry created, and is a watercolor called Boy Artist. Anyways, I have identified almost 250 works of Earle by title and year of creation and where they were exhibited. Some have detailed description, but I've never seen the majority of those images, and I can only guess how many total paintings Larry produced in his lifetime. The last painting I found record of that Larry created was in 1921, so he was painting up until the year he died. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that, but this is his death certificate. His career in life ended at 6 p.m. on November 20, 1921. He walked from his home on Union a few blocks down Cherry Street to a party given in his honor at the home of Frank Forsyth, who was a Board of Education member, on Lafayette, right behind where St. Mary's Hospital is right now. Larry collapsed on the sidewalk, and it was several minutes before he was discovered there, and that's where he died. Dr. Burton Corbus is the doctor who signed this death certificate. Dr. Corbus lived across the street from Larry on Union, and so knew him and his sister as well. In fact, Dr. Corbus signed the death certificate of Larry's sister Emma in 1917, just 4 years earlier. This is the last image of his work that I'm going to show today. It's called Trout Fishing. And it was donated in 1976 to the Grand Rapids Public Art Museum by Burton Corbus Jr. from his father's collection. Larry, his parents, and siblings are all buried in the family plot at Fulton Street Cemetery. This marker is plain and unadorned, but memorializes an important and colorful family in Grand Rapids history. We can't ignore the importance of what Marinus Harting told young Larry and how it inspired him throughout his ambitious life. You must learn to draw goot, first of all, and then draw some more, and always draw, for that the foundations of everything. Larry passed that on to his sons and grandchildren, to Michael Brady, and no doubt to many of his art students and other associates. This instruction, I think, is helpful to us now for other disciplines. One that comes to mind, researchers. You must learn to search Google, first of all, and then search some more. And always search, for that is the foundations of everything. Thank you for being here this morning. If you'd like more information on this artist and his life, feel free to visit my website. There are links to his full genealogy. And I think we're out of time, aren't we? Thank you.